There are objects in history so laden with horror, so deeply saturated with the memory of human suffering, that they transcend their physical form. They become symbols, dark monuments to an act of cruelty so specific and so theatrical that it defies the simple passage of time. One such object, long since lost to dust and decay, was a chair. Not a throne of gold and ivory, nor a simple seat of wood, but a chair of judgment, upholstered in the freshly tanned, weeping skin of the man who had previously sat upon it. This was not a myth born of campfire tales or the fevered imagination of a poet. It was a calculated act of statecraft, a piece of political theater designed to burn a single, terrifying message into the minds of all who saw it: that in the Achaemenid Empire, under the reign of King Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, justice was not merely an ideal to be pursued, but a predator that, when betrayed, would turn and devour the betrayer. To understand how such a monstrous artifact came to be, we must look beyond the simple fact of its existence and delve into the story of the man whose very flesh provided its grisly decoration, a royal judge named Sisamnes, whose fall from grace was not merely a punishment, but a gruesome and unforgettable lesson in the absolute nature of power. The story begins not with the crime, but with the world that made the crime possible and its punishment conceivable. The Persian Empire of the 6th century BCE was a colossus, a sprawling dominion stitched together by the military genius of its founder, Cyrus the Great. From the shores of the Aegean to the dusty plains of the Indus Valley, it was an empire of unprecedented scale, a tapestry of 100 different peoples, languages, and gods, all held in a delicate balance by a system of centralized authority. At the apex of this system sat the King of Kings, an autocrat whose word was not merely law, but a force of nature. When Cyrus died, his throne passed to his son, Cambyses II, a man who inherited an empire but not, perhaps, his father's temperament. While Cyrus was remembered for his clemency and vision, Cambyses' reputation, filtered through the often hostile lens of Greek historians like Herodotus, is one of volatility, impiety, and a capacity for spectacular cruelty. He was a conqueror, successfully adding the ancient kingdom of Egypt to his domain, but his reign was marked by whispers of madness, of sacred bulls slaughtered and temples desecrated, of family members executed on a whim. Whether he was truly insane or simply a ruthless pragmatist ruling a brutal age is a matter of debate. What is not debatable, however, is that he understood power in its most visceral form. For Cambyses, power was not an abstract concept. It was a tool to be wielded visibly, dramatically, and often terrifyingly. Within this empire, a special class of officials existed to administer the king's law, the royal judges. These were men appointed for life, a position that granted them immense prestige and power. They were the arbiters of disputes, the guardians of contracts, and the ultimate earthly authority in matters of right and wrong for the millions of subjects under the king's rule. Their lifetime appointment was intended to insulate them from political pressure and financial temptation, to lift them above the grubby machinations of lesser men, so that they could dispense a pure and unblemished form of justice. Sisamnes was one of these men. By all accounts, he was a respected figure, a man whose name was synonymous with the law itself. He would have lived a life of comfort and privilege in one of the great Persian capitals, perhaps Susa or Pasargadae. He would have been a man of family, a patriarch whose status afforded his children every advantage. In the great halls of justice, his voice, calm and measured, would have untangled the most complex of legal knots. He was the embodiment of the system's ideal, a wise, impartial, and incorruptible servant of the king and the god Ahura Mazda, from whom all truth and order flowed. His public persona was a mask of perfect integrity. But beneath the mask, a seed of corruption was waiting for the right soil in which to sprout. The societal expectation placed upon a figure like Sisamnes was immense. In a system where the king was the ultimate source of law, his judges were his mortal representatives. Their integrity was a reflection of the king's own. A corrupt judge did not just wrong a plaintiff or a defendant. He undermined the very foundation of the empire. He introduced a flaw into the divine order, suggesting that the king's justice was for sale, that wealth could triumph over right, that the entire majestic edifice of Persian law was a hollow sham. The king, therefore, had a vested, existential interest in ensuring his judges remained pure. The stability of his vast, multicultural empire depended not just on the strength of his armies, but on the belief among his subjects that they could receive a fair hearing. Without this belief, resentment would fester, and the intricate web of loyalty and obligation that held the satrapies together would begin to unravel. Sisamnes, in his comfortable life, in his high-backed chair of carved cedar, knew all of this. He was not an ignorant man. He was a master of the law and its philosophical underpinnings. His eventual crime would not be one of ignorance, but of a profound and fatal arrogance. He believed himself to be above the very system he was sworn to protect. The turning point, the single act that would unravel his entire existence, came in the form of a lawsuit. It was, by the standards of the empire, a mundane affair, a dispute over a significant sum of money and land. On one side stood a nobleman of considerable wealth and influence, a man accustomed to getting his way. On the other, a litigant of lesser means, but one whose claim, by all objective measures, was just and legally sound. The case was brought before Sisamnes. The arguments were made, the evidence presented. To any impartial observer, the correct verdict was clear. But in the shadows, outside the courtroom, another transaction was taking place. The wealthy nobleman, unwilling to trust in the whims of justice, sought to purchase a more reliable outcome. A secret meeting was arranged. A bribe was offered, a quantity of gold so substantial it could secure a man's lineage for generations, a sum that glittered with the promise of a life beyond even the considerable comforts Sisamnes already enjoyed. In that moment, Sisamnes stood at a precipice. On one side was his oath, his duty, his entire identity as a royal judge. On the other was a bag of gold and the intoxicating allure of easy wealth. We can imagine his internal monologue, the serpent of rationalization whispering in his ear. Who would ever know? It was one man's word against another. The case was complex enough that a verdict either way could be plausibly justified. The nobleman was a powerful figure. Making an enemy of him was unwise. The other man was insignificant. In the grand scheme of the empire, what did this one small injustice truly matter? Greed, layered with arrogance, clouded his judgment. He convinced himself that he was clever enough to conceal the act, that he was important enough to be immune to the consequences. He reached out his hand. He took the gold, and in that silent, fateful act, he ceased to be a judge and became a criminal. He sealed a pact, not with the nobleman, but with his own destruction. He rendered his verdict, a twisted judgment that flew in the face of a law, and awarded the case to the man who had paid him. But Sisamnes had forgotten a crucial element of the world he inhabited. In the sprawling bureaucracy of the Persian court, not all men were corrupt. There are always those who watch, those who listen, those who take their duties with a terrifying seriousness. In this case, it may have been a scribe, a clerk who had recorded the proceedings and saw the blatant perversion of justice. It could have been an informant, a whisperer who made his living trading in the secrets of powerful men. Whoever it was, the story of the unjust verdict and the rumored bribe made its way through the corridors of power, slithering like a serpent until it reached the one place Sisamnes had gambled it never would, the ears of King Cambyses. For the king, this was not merely a report of minor bureaucratic malfeasance. It was a direct challenge to his authority, a stain upon his reign. It was precisely the kind of rot he sought to excise with theatrical brutality. But Cambyses was not a man for hasty action. He would not act on rumor alone. He would set a trap, and he would make the exposure of Sisamnes a public spectacle. The king's plan was one of cold, calculating patience. He summoned Sisamnes, not with accusations, but with questions. He brought in the original litigants once more, ostensibly to review the case. He laid out the facts as he understood them, his voice calm, his eyes watching the judge's every flicker of emotion. He gave Sesamnes the opportunity to confess, to recant, to explain himself. But the judge, trapped in his own web of lies, held firm. He repeated his corrupt justifications, perhaps with a tremor in his voice he could not conceal, but he did not break. He doubled down on his deceit, digging his own grave deeper with every word. He stood before the King of Kings and lied, a final act of hubris that sealed his fate in the most horrific way imaginable. The king listened to the end, his expression unreadable. And when Sesamnes had finished speaking, the mask of royal inquiry dropped from Cambyses' face. In its place was a fury as cold and sharp as obsidian. The trap had been sprung. The evidence, likely gathered from the loyal informant, was presented. The nobleman who paid the bribe, likely promised immunity for his testimony, confessed his role. Sesamnes stood exposed, his lies stripped bare in the center of the court. His world, once so solid and ordered, collapsed into a vortex of terror. The silence in the hall would have been absolute, thick with the fear of every courtier and official present. They were not just watching the fall of one man. They were seeing a reflection of their own vulnerability. Sesamnes, moments before a figure of power, was now a trembling, broken thing, prostrate on the floor before his king. The fall was dizzying, total, and public. He was no longer a judge. He was no longer a man of status. He was merely a vessel for the king's wrath. And that wrath was to be biblical in its scope. Cambyses pronounced his sentence, and it was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty, designed not just to end a life, but to annihilate a legacy and transform a man into a permanent, hideous warning. Sesamnes was not to be simply executed. That would be too quick, too merciful. First, he was to be arrested and stripped of his robes, his symbols of office rendered meaningless. Then, he was to be taken to a public place and flayed alive. The horror of this sentence cannot be overstated. Flaying, the systematic removal of the skin from a living body, is a punishment of unimaginable agony. It is a slow, meticulous process of deconstruction, turning a human being into a screaming piece of anatomy. But Cambyses' sentence did not end there. The true genius of its cruelty lay in what came next. After Sesamnes was dead and his body disposed of, his skin, his entire skin, carefully peeled from his corpse, was to be taken to a tanner. It was to be cured, stretched, and treated, not as a remnant of a man, but as a piece of leather. And this leather, this human vellum, was to be used to upholster the very judicial seat from which Sesamnes had dispensed his corrupt justice. The final, crushing blow of the sentence was this. Cambyses appointed Sesamnes' own son, a man named Otanes, to take his father's place as the new royal judge. Otanes would be forced, every single day, to sit upon the skin of his own father, to feel the texture of his flesh beneath him as he dispensed the king's law, a constant, tactile reminder of the price of corruption. The execution itself would have been a state-managed event. It was not a hidden affair conducted in a dark dungeon, but a public performance in the city square. Sesamnes would have been dragged from the palace, his pleas for mercy ignored. The crowd would have gathered, a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. This was the king's justice made manifest. The executioners were not frenzied killers. They were craftsmen of pain. With specialized knives, they would have begun their work. The process is one of methodical precision, starting at the extremities, the feet or the hands, and working inwards. Each cut calculated to separate the epidermis and dermis from the underlying muscle and tissue, keeping the skin as intact as possible. The agony Sesamnes experienced is beyond the descriptive power of language. It is a total sensory assault, a symphony of pain that overwhelms the mind, a living nightmare from which there is no escape. He would have remained conscious for a terrifyingly long time, a screaming, writhing testament to the king's decree, until blood loss, shock, and trauma finally granted him the release of death. He died not as a judge, but as raw material. For Otanes, the horror was of a different, more enduring kind. He was compelled to witness this. He watched his father, the man who raised him, be systematically unmade before a jeering crowd. He saw the person he was descended from reduced to a piece of bleeding meat. This trauma alone would be enough to break any man. But his ordeal was only beginning. While his father's corpse was being stripped, Otanes was being fitted for his new robes of office. He was now a royal judge, elevated to one of the highest positions in the empire, but his elevation felt like a damnation. His father's sin was now his inheritance, a debt he would be forced to repay for the rest of his life. He was not just the son of a judge. He was the son of the flayed judge, a title that would follow him forever. The aftermath of the execution was as cold and methodical as the act itself. The skin of Sesamnes, a grotesque relic, was handed over to the imperial tanners. These men, accustomed to working with the hides of cattle and goats, were now tasked with this unprecedented project. We can only imagine their revulsion, or perhaps their professional detachment, as they scraped, cured, salted, and oiled the human hide. They would have worked to preserve it perfectly, to ensure its durability, for this was no ordinary leather. This was a state document written in flesh. They would have noted the familiar patterns of the human form, the place where the beard grew, the calluses on the hands, the scars of a lifetime, and stretched them flat, erasing the man to create the material. The process would have taken weeks, the foul-smelling work a constant, grim task, until what was once the living boundary of man was now a supple, durable, and utterly monstrous textile. Then came the day of its installation. The old judicial chair, the one Sesamnes had occupied in his arrogance, was brought forth. Carpenters and upholsterers, under the watchful eye of a court official, set to their work. They cut the tan skin to size. They stretched it taut over the seat and backrest, securing it with bronze or iron studs. The finished object was now ready. It was returned to the Hall of Justice, placed back in its position of authority, looking for all the world like a normal chair, perhaps covered in a peculiarly grained, discolored leather. But everyone knew what it was. Every person in that hall, from the highest-ranking noble to the lowliest clerk, knew they were looking at the skin of Sesamnes. The air itself would have seemed to crackle with the energy of the thing. It was no longer a piece of furniture. It was a totem of fear, an icon of the king's absolute and terrible power. And then came the moment for which this entire ghastly performance was orchestrated. Otanes, robed in the formal attire of a royal judge, was escorted into the hall. His face would have been a pale, emotionless mask, concealing a universe of torment. He walked towards a chair, his steps heavy, each one an eternity. The court watched in breathless silence. This was the climax of the lesson. He reached the chair. He would have paused, his eyes fixed on the thing he was supposed to sit on. Could he smell his father? Could he see a familiar freckle or imperfection in the hide? Did the strange, soft texture seem to mock him? He was a prisoner of his new position. To refuse would be to defy the king, an act that would surely lead to his own execution. He had no choice. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and lowered himself onto the seat. He sat on the skin of his father. The psychological weight of that moment is almost impossible to comprehend. For Otanes, every day of his judicial career would be a reenactment of this initial trauma. Every time he presided over a case, he would feel the physical remnant of his father's agony beneath him. It was a constant, intimate, and inescapable reminder. It was designed to be. Cambyses had not just punished Sesamnes. He had created a living instrument of justice in Otanes. The lesson was clear. If you are a judge, remember the fate of the man whose skin you are sitting on. The story of the flayed judge and his son, the unwilling inheritor of this gruesome legacy, would have spread like wildfire throughout the empire. Every satrap, every official, every tax collector in the furthest reaches of the Persian domain would have heard the tale. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, far more effective than any royal edict or decree. It was a story that crawled under the skin, a visceral horror that bypassed the intellect and lodged itself directly in the primal centers of the brain. Fear, Cambyses demonstrated, was the most effective tool of governance. The life of Otanes from that point forward is a matter of speculation, but it is hard to imagine it was a happy one. He was a man living under a permanent shadow, his own identity subsumed by his father's crime and punishment. How could he ever be impartial? Every litigant who came before him would see not just a judge, but the man who sat on his father's skin. Every decision he made would be scrutinized through that horrific lens. Was he being overly harsh to prove he was not like his father? Was he being overly lenient out of a sense of broken empathy? He was trapped in a psychological prison constructed from his father's flesh. Perhaps he became the most incorruptible judge in the history of Persia, driven by a terror so profound that the mere thought of a bribe would induce physical nausea. Or perhaps the trauma broke him, leaving him a hollow shell, a man going through the motions of his office while his soul had died long ago in that public square. He is a tragic figure, a victim as much as his father was a perpetrator, a son forced to bear the full, agonizing weight of his father's sins. The story of Sesamnes and his terrible fate is preserved for us primarily by the Greek historian Herodotus. Writing a century later, Herodotus included it in his histories as an example of the Persians' concept of justice and the character of their king, Cambyses. For a Greek audience, the story would have been both shocking and strangely affirming. It confirmed their view of the Persian monarchy as a tyrannical, barbaric system, where even high-ranking officials could be subjected to torture and mutilation at the whim of a despotic ruler. It stood in stark contrast to the Athenian ideal of democratic law, even if the reality in Athens was often far from the ideal. Yet, even for Herodotus, there is a sense of grim approval. He presents the story not just as an act of cruelty, but as an act of justice, albeit a terrifyingly severe one. The punishment, in its awful symmetry, fits the crime. The betrayal of sacred trust is met with the ultimate violation of the body. The narrative's power is such that it has echoed through the centuries, finding a new and potent life long after the Achaemenid Empire had crumbled to dust. In the late 15th century, the city officials of Bruges, in modern-day Belgium, sought a powerful piece of art to remind their own magistrates of the importance of impartiality. They commissioned the Flemish painter Gerard David to create a work for their town hall's courtroom. The subject they chose was the judgment of Cambyses. David produced a stunning and gruesome diptych, a two-panel painting that depicts the story in unflinching detail. The first panel shows Sesamnes, seated and confident, accepting the bribe while the king watches from the background. The second, larger panel is a scene of raw horror. It shows the flaying of Sesamnes in meticulous, clinical detail. The judge is pinned to a table, his face a mask of agony, as executioners calmly and methodically peel the skin from his body. In the background, on the judicial throne, sits the pale, youthful figure of Otanes, his face a study in stoic grief, with the flayed skin of his father draped over the chair's back. This painting, displayed prominently where legal judgments were made, transplanted the ancient Persian story into a contemporary European context. The figures are dressed in 15th century attire. The message was not historical. It was immediate. It was a direct warning to the magistrates of Bruges. Look upon this image. Remember Sesamnes. Know that the crime of judicial corruption is so heinous that it merits this level of retribution. The painting transformed Cambyses from a half-mad Persian tyrant into a universal symbol of righteous, if brutal, authority. It demonstrates the story's enduring power as a cautionary tale, a moral lesson so potent that it transcends its specific historical origins. It speaks to a fundamental human anxiety, that the systems we create to protect us can be poisoned from within, and that such poison requires a radical, burning cure. So what is the ultimate legacy of Sesamnes? He is a man who has achieved a kind of immortality, but of the most hideous sort. He is remembered not for his wisdom or his life's work, but for the manner of his death and the grotesque use to which his remains were put. His story serves as a stark dividing line in the concept of justice. On one side is the ideal of rehabilitation, mercy, and proportionate response. On the other is the ancient, visceral belief in retributive justice, in punishment as a form of moral and physical scouring. Cambyses' act was one of supreme political theater. He understood that power is perception. By making the punishment so unforgettable, he ensured that the lesson would outlive him, outlive his empire, and become a permanent part of the human conversation about law and its abuses. The chair itself, of course, is long gone. It likely disintegrated within a generation or two, a fragile object made of the most fragile of materials. But its image, the mental picture of that awful throne, endures. It represents the ultimate fusion of the abstract and the physical. The concept of justice, so often depicted as a blindfolded woman with a scale, is here given a terrifyingly concrete form. It is a chair of human skin. It forces us to confront the raw, brutal foundations upon which civilizations are often built. We may recoil in horror from the barbarity of Cambyses' sentence, and rightly so. Our modern sensibilities are shaped by 2.5 millennia of legal and philosophical evolution. Yet, the story retains its power because the crime it punishes remains profoundly relevant. Judicial corruption is not a relic of the ancient world. It is a persistent threat in any society, a cancer that can metastasize through the body politic, eroding trust and destroying the lives of the innocent. The story of Sesamnes, in its extreme and graphic horror, holds up a dark mirror. It asks a deeply uncomfortable question. What is the appropriate price for betraying the public's most sacred trust? While we would never condone the act of flaying, the story forces us to contemplate the gravity of the offense. It reminds us that those who are given the power to judge their fellow human beings hold a responsibility so profound that its betrayal is not just a crime, but a kind of sacrilege against the very idea of a just society. The ghost of Sesamnes and the phantom chair upholstered in a skin remain as a final, silent judgment on all who would dare to follow his path, a grotesque but enduring monument to the idea that justice, in its most absolute form, can have a terrible and unforgettable price.